Lord, open our hearts and minds to your word and grace so that we might find strength in your promises and courage to walk through the uncertainty of our lives, trusting that you are always with us. Amen. Well, it's almost as if the people who decided on the readings for the lectionary knew that the U.S. elections were held around this time. These readings seem rather timely. The message today might be exactly what many of us need. I don't normally mention sermon titles, but I've titled this one, Firm Foundations in Times of Uncertainty. Amid the recent election, many feel apprehension and uncertain about their future. Regardless of where each of us may stand politically, it's clear that the results of this election are stirring up intense emotions. Some may feel anxious, others hopeful, some are excited, many are worried. It all depends on who you ask. Even still, others are uncertain about what this means for the direction of our nation. And at the heart of it, we may all be wondering, what does all this mean for me, for my family, my neighborhood, our country? In times like these, when the ground beneath us feels unstable, we must turn to God to help us strengthen our foundation. In the gospel reading today, we find Jesus' disciples marveling at the grandeur and permanence of the temple in Jerusalem. This wasn't just any temple. It represented stability, a source of identity and security. To those gathered disciples, it must have seemed like something that would last forever. Yet Jesus warns that even something as impressive as the temple is not immune to change. Not one stone will be left here upon another, he says. Imagine how shocked they must have been. It's almost as if Jesus were telling them, one day everything you depend on will change. Jesus wasn't trying to frighten them. He was teaching them, and us, not to place our ultimate trust in things that might one day crumble. Jesus is calling them to see that their true source is something greater, something that cannot be shaken. He reminds them that God's presence is not confined to buildings, political systems, or earthly powers. God dwells in the very depths of their hearts, and now in our hearts, and in the way we love one another. Even those we don't agree with, even if the things around us feel unstable. God's love and faithfulness will never change. Thinking about our own life, are there things that you lean on for security? A job, your financial stability, or even certain relationships? I know I do. While we must provide for ourselves to survive, those things we rely on sometimes feel shaky. While these supports are absolutely important, Jesus' message is clear. Our hope is not rooted in human structures or leaders, but in a deeper foundation of God's unfailing love and justice. This is sometimes difficult to fully come to terms with, especially when so much of what our leaders say and do directly affects our lives. When we look around and feel uncertain, we can lean on the promise that God is steadfast and faithful. God provides a solid ground we can stand on, no matter what. When work is stressful, when family life is challenging, when we are faced with health concerns, when the future feels uncertain, much like it does now, God is our constant. God is with us in the middle of it, offering strength, peace, and guidance. Jesus doesn't ask us to go through these changes alone. In Hebrews, in fact, we hear that we are called not just to endure uncertainty alone, but to encourage one another and gather together as people of faith. We are called to lift each other up in moments of worry, to share one another's burdens, and to provoke one another to love and good deeds, not neglecting to meet together, but encouraging one another. God knows that faith is best lived out in community because in times of upheaval, we need each other to remind us of God's love and promises. We need each other to stay grounded, to find encouragement, and to live out our faith. Let's think about how our own families, as well as our All Saints family here, those around you in the pews or watching on live stream, offer that stability and support. We all go through times when we feel worn out or uncertain. Many of us take the opportunity to step up to the mic, as it were, right, to ask this community for support after the announcements, right? The uniquely All Saints thing that I haven't seen too many other places. Maybe it's work stress, financial pressures, health concerns, or relationships that feel strained. In these moments, we're not meant to shoulder the weight on our own. This is why the church is so important. When we come together as a community, we are reminded that we are not alone. We're strengthened by each other's prayers, encouragement, and presence. Not only was this the sermon I needed to write this week, but it was the sermon I needed to hear. Most of you know that my mother Bonnie is the sole caregiver to my 100-year-old grandmother Laverne. I call her Nana. I'm her only grandchild who has ever called her that her whole life. She reminds me of that quite often. Without getting into too much detail, this week I was faced with a wall of uncertainty, wave after wave after wave. As my mother was hospitalized on Monday, I found myself in the span of about 15 minutes, the new sole caregiver for Nana. When the firefighters arrived at my mother's house on Monday, they began to examine her and ask me about her medical history. I glanced at my grandmother sitting in her chair, eating her Pop-Tarts, watching her game shows, somewhat oblivious to what was happening around her. I must have blanched. I thought, who is going to watch Nana? 1,000 thoughts came rushing through my mind, mostly uncertain about what was going to happen this week. I have a job. I can't just stay at home as much as I would love to. Nana can't stay by herself. And then it hit me. Oh Lord, I guess it's going to be me. Then another wall of uncertainty. How am I going to deal with that and be with my mother in the hospital, who clearly needs that support? Thanks be to God, we have a solid, chosen family, some of whom I've asked you to pray for the last few weeks. Those who came to our rescue, our neighbor and her husband, who are recovering from moving a portion of her lung last week fighting cancer. I was able to take Tuesday and Wednesday off from work, but I had to go back at the end of the week. I had hoped my mother would be released by then, but as each day unfolded and she wasn't improving as much as we had hoped, I started to panic. That wall of uncertainty kept hitting me right in the face. Until I remembered the sermon I had been writing for today. God is my foundation. God is who I turn to in times of need. And that is just what I did. I sat and I meditated for about 15 minutes and tried to push all thoughts out, and the thoughts that came in ended up helping. I contacted a few more of my family members, and we were able to come up with a care plan to make sure that my grandmother was taken care of and that my mother was also looked after in the hospital, and the 120 children that rely on me every week in San Francisco would still have their teacher. There were several logistical problems along the way. Obviously, each day gave a new problem, but I kept centering myself and reminding myself that God is my foundation. Thankfully, my mother came home on Friday, not without complications, but she, I pray, is on the mend. Now I can handle a lot. I have seen a lot in my days. I have dealt with a lot, but I cannot handle this alone. There is no way. It truly takes a village. As someone who is quite self-sufficient, it is sometimes hard for me to ask for help. Sometimes we just need a little nudge to remind us that God is with us, to help us see the good that surrounds us and those who are there to help. The uncertainty I felt this week, the continuous questioning of how I was going to accomplish everything that everyone needed me to do, and the blows we were taking with each new complication reminded me that I needed to focus on my foundation, my rock. I needed to focus on God to help me center. This quick onset of rapid panic due to circumstances out of my control reminds me of some of those feelings that we all shared, or most of us I'm sure shared, on November 5th. As we wrestle with the anxieties of today, we can find peace in each other's presence, like I did with my family and my chosen family, and seek God together as one body. The church, and by extension, each of us, is called to be a source of hope, a place where each person, regardless of political belief or background, and I'll say that again, regardless of political belief or background, can find rest, encouragement, and direction. Finally, Jesus reminds us that the upheavals we experience are the beginnings of the birth pangs. This is a powerful image. Anyone who has experienced childbirth or witnessed it knows that labor is intense and exhausting. But labor pains aren't meaningless. They lead to something beautiful and miraculous. A new life, a fresh start, and a profound joy. Our world currently groans in pain, and sometimes that pain can feel overwhelming. Jesus' words remind us that even the painful, uncertain moments in life can lead to something new and life-giving. This doesn't mean that the difficulties we face aren't real. They absolutely are. But God is always at work, even in the challenging parts of our lives, bringing forth something new, something good. Jesus invites us to see this struggle as part of something larger. Think about a difficult experience you've gone through, maybe a time when you felt lost or hurt. Even in those moments, God was working within you, maybe teaching you something you needed, building your resilience, maybe even deepening your compassion. And in hindsight, you may see that those struggles led you to a new chapter, a fresh beginning. This is not only true in our individual lives, but in the broader world as well. While elections, changes in leadership, and world events may feel overwhelming, God is always working through it all, using each of us to build a more loving, compassionate, and just world. When we face these birth pangs, we must trust that God is doing something bigger and more beautiful than we can yet see. So how can we take these words into our lives today? First, I believe we're invited to shift our focus from things that may feel unstable to God's unchanging love and presence. Let's remember that our true foundation doesn't rest on any one institution, leader, or situation. Our stability and peace come from God's love for us, which will never waver. Second, I think we're called to draw strength from this community. Whether you're here every Sunday, once a month, or even a holiday Episcopalian, you are part of this community, and each of us brings something valuable to this church family. And we need each other, especially when life feels uncertain, like it does today. God has given us one another to encourage and lift each other up. So let's keep showing up, support one another, and remind each other that we are never alone. Finally, let's embrace the change as part of God's ongoing work. I realize this is a difficult ask. The challenges we face individually and as a community are not the end of the story. They are part of God's process of bringing about new life and new possibilities. Even when we don't see it, sometimes especially when we don't see it, God is at work, shaping us and shaping the world into something more beautiful, more just, and more loving. So, dear family, as we navigate these uncertain times, may we keep our focus on the unchanging love of God. May we build each other up, find comfort in our community, and hold onto the hope that in God's hands, our struggles are not the end, but the beginning of something new.